had been making videos covering the Suikoden 1 Soul Eater novel chapter by chapter. I covered the prologue and the first 14 of the 36 chapters, but based on the views, not a whole lot of people were interested in listening to in-depth readings of the novels. So instead of continuing covering the novels chapter by chapter, what I'm going to do is I'll provide brief summaries of each chapter covering the major differences between the game and the novel in this hour-long video. Maybe this will be more manageable for people instead of spending 10 to 30 minutes per chapter. I know that's going to be a little disappointing to those of you who are enjoying the novel readings, but unfortunately it's either this or I just stop covering them entirely, and it'd be a shame to stop covering them as the novels contain many new and original scenes which greatly enhance the story of the game. If this video does decently, I'll make another video covering the differences between Suikoden 2 and its novelization, and then maybe 2 more videos covering the Suikoden 4 and 5 novelizations. Also, I know there's a small group of people who dismiss anything that wasn't written by Yoshitaka Murayama as not real Suikoden, but Murayama wrote an afterword for the novel which says it is real Suikoden. I won't read all of it, but I'll pick out some quotes. He said, "Of course, there are differences between a game and a novel, and I was excited to see how those differences, new perspectives, fresh ideas, and added depth would shape the world of Suikoden in new ways. Reading it, I found myself fully immersed, not as a creator, but as a reader. I was thrilled to learn more about the inner lives of characters whose stories couldn't be fully explored in the game. The scene where Viktor and Flick's troops charge under Matthew's orders, that was something I could never quite capture in the game, no matter how much I wanted to. This novel introduces new interpretations and settings shaped by Hori Shinjiro's own vision. They don't always align perfectly with mine, but that's something I embrace. Just as Suikoden is a world of many different perspectives, I respect the novel's unique take on its lore. In fact, I believe these variations only serve to deepen Suikoden's world. Rather than a single rigid truth, I prefer a world rich with diversity, contradictions, and different values. Fantasy thrives when many people contribute their own ideas and imaginations. My hope is that the world of Suikoden will continue to grow, shaped by many hands for years to come." There you have it, straight from Murayama himself. Anyway, let's dive into the differences between the game and the novel. The first big difference between the novel and the game is that the novel contains a 9-page prologue chapter that takes place before the game begins. This prologue chapter is a brand new scene that focuses on Luke and Leknaat. Leknaat is performing the stargazing ritual to complete the astral predications for the Empire, but is shocked to discover that the 108 stars of destiny have begun to gather. She explains to Luke what she saw and tells him that he'll be involved in the upcoming conflict. She encourages him to fluff the report for the astral predications so as not to alarm the Empire. It's a nice scene that pulls back the curtain on Leknaat just a little bit. Chapter 1 covers from the beginning of the game up to the banquet before Teo departs, but it includes a brand new scene that takes place a few hours before the beginning of the game before Tyr and Teo's audience with the Emperor. Tyr and Ted are hunting for rabbits for the banquet before Teo travels north on assignment. They work together to catch a rabbit, but Tyr is unable to kill it and the rabbit escapes. It's a good little scene with plenty of dialogue that highlights how strong the friendship between Tyr and Ted is. Chapter 2 covers from Teo's departure up to Tyr meeting Futch and Black before travelling to Magician's Island. Chapter 2 includes an expanded scene of Teo and Gremio watching over Tyr while he sleeps before Teo departs. Teo and Gremio have a conversation about Kraze, and Teo questions how someone like Kraze rose to the rank of commander of the Imperial Guard and suspects he may have had help from people higher up pulling the strings. Gremio shares his suspicions. After departing the city, Teo asked Alan and Glen Shiel if they feel the Emperor and the Empire have changed recently. They tell him they're unsure as they didn't get to meet the Emperor this time, but Teo still has his concerns. This was a very short scene, but it was a nice touch to show that Teo, despite always being away on assignment along the border with the city-states, wasn't completely blind to the problems that were now beginning to plague the Empire. Chapter 3 covers from the group's arrival on Magician's Island to returning to Kraze with the astral predications. In the novel, Luke doesn't summon a clay doll to fight them. Instead, they have a short conversation. He tells them that Leknaat is waiting at the top of the tower and then teleports away. Tyr and the others were in awe of Luke's teleportation magic as it's extremely high-level magic, then they groaned as they made their way up the tower. At the end of the chapter, Luke and Leknaat have another brand new scene where they talk about Tyr. Leknaat tells Luke that the stars can be cruel for burdening a child with such a fate, and she wants to watch over and protect his future. She then prays to the stars to guide him down the right path. This was another nice little scene that pulled back the curtain on Leknaat just a little bit more. Some people out there suspect that Leknaat is going to be the big bad or she has malevolent intentions, but these small scenes she gets in the novel say otherwise. Also, Kraze is portrayed as an even bigger slimeball in the novel. He's always talking down to and scoffing at Tyr and his group like they're beneath him, more so than he does in the game. The novel does a great job of making you hate him even more than the game does. Chapters 4 and 5 are very different from the game. Kanan is already in Rockland investigating the missing tax money, and Tyr has been ordered to travel there and assist him. But as Tyr and his group approach Rockland, they see black smoke coming from the village. They rush to the village to check out what's happening and find that the village is under attack from the Mount Seifu bandits. Grady and Kanan have been tied up and taken prisoner by Varkas and Sidonia, and the villagers are celebrating rather than being fearful. Tyr and his group fight off the bandits and rescue Grady and Kanan. After rescuing the two, Tyr starts to see the corruption firsthand as Grady orders his men to force the villagers to conduct repairs to his mansion and to push them as hard as need be, but he lets slip that he has the tax money by telling the soldiers not to allow the villagers near the storehouse. Grady convinces Kanan to send Tyr and the others to Mount Seifu to deal with the bandits. The next day, they set out with a young girl named Rune who acts as their guide. Rune lures them into a trap and they fall into a pit where the Queen Ant lives. Ted saves them with the Soul Eater, and the group made their way out and launch a surprise attack on the bandits' fort. Varkas and Sidonia flee with Rune in their arms. Tyr thinks they've taken Rune captive and chases after. He defeats Varkas in a duel, but Rune makes him stop. He has a talk with Varkas, and Varkas tells him the truth about what's happening in Rockland. Tyr doesn't want to believe it, but deep down he knows it's true and lets them go. I absolutely love these chapters in the novel, and I thought they were massive improvements over how the Rockland tax arc was depicted in the game. Chapters 6 and 7 are mostly the same as the game, but with extended dialogue. They cover from Tyr returning from Mount Seifu up to encountering Viktor after becoming a fugitive, but there is a short new scene at the beginning of Chapter 6 where Tyr heads back to the bandits' fort and orders his group to free all of the bandits they've captured. They were confused by his order, but Ted complied, saying Tyr wouldn't have asked them to do such a thing without a good reason. Han, however, was annoyed by the order. Kanan was outraged by their actions. Just like with Kraze, Kanan is also a bigger slimeball in the novel, always talking down to people and often referring to them as scum and worthless. Chapter 8 covers from Tyr leaving Gregminster up to Odessa's death, and it's quite different in the novel. On the road to Lennenkamp, Viktor and Tyr form a bond. Viktor teaches him how to hunt, how to fish, how to build shelter to take cover from the rain, and everything he needs to survive on the road. Unlike the game, the Kayaki Inn isn't raided by Imperial soldiers. Instead, Viktor wakes the group up at night by appearing from under the clock in their room and inviting them downstairs into the sewers. When they follow him down, Cleo and Gremio draw their weapons when they recognize Odessa as the leader of the Liberation Army. Flick and Humphrey appear and the four engage in a battle. Tyr, Viktor and Odessa desperately try to stop the fight, and the fight finally ends in a tie with all of them exhausted. As Varkas and Sidonia were never captured, the arc where Tyr rescues them from Rockland is cut. Instead, Tyr stays the night in Lennenkamp getting to know the members of the Liberation Army. Tyr and Odessa travelling to Sardi with the Firespear blueprints was also cut, and Odessa's Sardi speech happened in the Lennenkamp sewers. While Tyr and Odessa were talking privately in the hideout, Imperial soldiers raided the inn. They launched an attack from above while more snuck in through the sewers. Odessa ordered Flick to gather as many of their men as he can and run away. Humphrey, Gremio and Cleo fought the soldiers upstairs, while Tyr, Odessa and Viktor fought off the Imperials in the sewers. Odessa was killed when she threw herself in front of Tyr to protect him from an arrow fired by an Imperial soldier. When I was doing readings of each chapter, this chapter was a bit poorly received from people. They felt the changes this chapter made were worse than the game, and I kind of agree. In the game, travelling to Sardi and back would have taken a couple of weeks. Plenty of time for Tyr and Odessa to form a bond on the road. But in the novel, they barely knew each other for 24 hours. It was a very rushed chapter in the novel. Then chapter 9 was the final chapter in the first volume of the 3-volume novelisation. This chapter covered from Tyr fleeing Lennenkamp up to recruiting Lepant. Much of this chapter is skimmed over in the novel with very brief summaries, and it's pretty much the same as the game, but it does include a brand new scene with Windy and Ted in a dungeon in Gregminster. The ninja that attacked Tyr in Torrin Castle in the game only spied on Tyr in the novel. He reports Tyr's whereabouts to Windy, then Windy turns to Ted, who's chained up in the dark dungeon. She taunts Ted about Tyr and then forcefully embeds a Conqueror rune into his body to bend him to her will. I thought this scene in the novel was fantastic. We suspected she made Ted suffer in the game after capturing him, but nothing was ever shown. The novel pretty much outright tells us she tormented and tortured him in that dungeon. Chapter 10 begins the second volume of the 3-volume novelization. It takes place 3 months after Tyr became the leader of the Liberation Army. This chapter covers how Tyr met Kirkus, which is mostly the same as the game, but there's a couple of small new scenes in it. There's a new scene with Tyr, Gremio and Viktor. Gremio went to wake Tyr up and tell him that breakfast is ready. They head to the dining room to find Viktor sitting at a table with the entire pot of stew. Gremio gets annoyed at Viktor, but Viktor awkwardly laughs it off and invites Tyr over. Viktor and Tyr have a little chat over breakfast, and Viktor tells Tyr that Kwanda began oppressing the people of the Great Forest about 3 months ago. Tyr remembers some memories he had of Kwanda when he was a small child, and the things Viktor tells him doesn't sound like the Kwanda he remembers. Viktor encourages Tyr to go speak to Matthew about it. Tyr and Gremio then take a walk and find Kirkus at the pier. They help him inside and Cleo nurses him back to health. Kirkus confirms Viktor's story. Tyr and Matthew then have a little chat and they both agree something is up, as this doesn't seem like the actions of the Kwanda they both know. Chapter 10 was a very slow chapter in the novel, but these little scenes help bring Viktor's goofy but caring personality to life. They show us glimpses of Tyr's upbringing and Matthew's past. They add so much to the story to flesh it out. These little moments could have greatly improved the game. Chapter 11 covers up to Tyr and his group being imprisoned by the elves and being freed by Sylvina. The only difference in this chapter compared to the game is that their encounter with Kuramimi in the Kobold village was completely different in the novel. When they arrive at the Kobold village, they discover signs of recent battle. There were signs of recent habitation, but no sign of a single kobold. Imperial soldiers came advancing out of the bushes to ambush the group, but Kuramimi leapt out of a house and surprise attacked the Imperials. Tyr and his group rush to Kuramimi's aid and they push back the Imperials out of the village. Kuramimi was mistrustful of them but slowly warmed up to them until Viktor tricked him into revealing where the kobolds are hiding. Kuramimi ran off flustered, but Viktor laughed and told him his secret is safe with them. Then the rest of the chapter is the same. They go to the elves to help and get thrown in prison. Much like many of the changes in the novel, I thought this was a great chapter. Kuramimi's introduction was handled excellently and it's got a great payoff in a few chapters. Chapter 12 covers from Tyr and his group leaving the village of the elves to meeting the dwarves until they return to the village of the elves. The entire dwarven section is covered in a brief flashback summary. They instantly believe Tyr is telling the truth and offer their assistance. The dwarven vault is cut. When they're returning back down the mountain to the village of the elves, instead of simply seeing the forest on fire, they witness Kwanda using the burning mirror to destroy the entire forest. They rush back to the village of the elves, and after the same scene as the game where Kirkus throws the ring on the ground, Matthew shows up with the Liberation Army along with Humphrey and Sanchez, and they decide to attack Kwanda. Chapter 13 covers the battle between the Liberation Army and Kwanda Rossman. The way the author wrote this chapter was like he was describing a cutscene. It's by far one of the best chapters in the entire novel. You get to visualize a real battle in your head instead of playing a rock paper scissors minigame. There's a scene at the beginning where the Liberation Army are holding a meeting to make plans for the upcoming battle. Leo suggests attacking at night to remove the advantage of the burning mirror, and Matthew agrees. Matthew forms a plan to use Kwanda's temper against him to lure him out of the castle and into a trap. Lepant leads the main unit and taunts Kwanda at the castle gates. Kwanda rides out to meet him in battle, but Lepant retreats down the forest path. Kwanda chases after him, then Valeria and Pan's units ambush Kwanda's flanks while Kirkus's unit fires volleys of arrows at them. Kwanda signals for reinforcements from the castle who come pouring out and attack Valeria's unit. Kuramimi and the kobolds arrive in the forest and rush to the Liberation Army's aid and assist Valeria's unit. Humphrey's unit then arrive to relieve Pan to allow him to treat the wounded before he reorganizes his men and rejoins the fight. Matthew orders Viktor and Tyr's units to assist Lepant, but Kwanda forms his army up into a big unbreakable wall and pushes his way through and returns to the castle. The battle lasted almost the entire night, and just as the sun was rising and Kwanda was about to use the burning mirror, the dwarves arrived and destroyed it with the firewing cannon. Honestly, I didn't do this chapter justice here. Go watch the standalone video covering chapter 13. It's an awesome chapter. It would have been incredible to experience it like a Suikoden 2 war battle. Chapter 14 is as far as I covered up to in my readings of the novel. This chapter wraps up the Great Forest arc and it's a little different from the game. During this chapter, it's revealed that Kwanda has no respect for Barbarossa while under the control of Windy's conqueror Rune and only obeys her orders. Tyr defeats Kwanda in a duel and the conqueror Rune leaves his body and flies back to Gregminster. After returning to his old self, Kwanda is disgusted by his actions and wishes to be executed for his crimes. Tyr spares him and Kwanda merges the remainder of his forces with the Liberation Army. This chapter also included a short new scene with Teo stationed in the Caracas Desert. A messenger arrived from Gregminster to inform him that Kwanda had been defeated and taken prisoner by the Liberation Army. He also informed Teo that there were rumours that his son is the leader of the Liberation Army. Teo dismissed the news as preposterous but was concerned that he hadn't heard from Tyr in months. This was a really good dialogue-heavy chapter in the novel that gave us a better look at Kwanda and Teo, not as generals but as people. It also explored the pain and inner struggle Kirkus was going through as he needed to be talked down from killing Kwanda. Chapter 15 covers the return of Flick. It takes place 3 months later as winter approaches. It's an incredibly short chapter and there's not a whole lot different in this chapter in the novel from the game. It's more or less the exact same thing with slightly extended dialogue. There is a very short training scene at the beginning between Tyr and Gremio though. Flick then shows up and storms off in a huff when Matthew tells him Odessa is dead. Tyr and Viktor visit him in Kaku the next day and he comes to his senses and joins them. Chapter 16 covers from the attack on Garan Fortress up to Tyr preparing to infiltrate Sonier prison. This chapter is quite lengthy as it's dialogue heavy and it contains some differences from the novel. The Liberation Army travels to Garan Fortress during the winter. Matthew forbids Tyr from taking to the field during the battle and orders him to stand on the sidelines as a spectator. Tyr tried to argue as he didn't want special treatment, but Matthew gave him a speech telling him that soldiers are replaceable but leaders are not. At Matthew's words, Tyr begrudgingly stayed back and watched the battle. The battle itself was quite short. The Imperial forces marched out of Garan Fortress. Flick led the main unit in the centre and immediately killed the Imperial commander. Viktor and Humphrey's unit circled around and flanked the Imperials, while Kirkus's unit fired volleys of arrows. The Imperials were instantly crushed and were unable to retreat back into the fortress, so they fled across the bridge into the Kunan region instead. The next part is similar to the game but with extended dialogue. Flick and Pon want to press their advantage, but Matthew recommends caution. At Flick's insistence, they end up attacking Scarleticia Castle and are soundly defeated. The pollen from the rose on Scarleticia caused the soldiers of the Liberation Army great pain and Millic's forces cut through them. LePont, Humphrey and Kirkus's units rescued Viktor and Flick's units who took the brunt of the damage and they retreated back to Garan Fortress to treat their wounded. The Lucan arc is different in the novel. Millik had already imprisoned Lucan a year ago under the false accusation of selling poison, but the real reason was to prevent him from making an antidote for Antoinette's poison. If you don't remember, Antoinette is the name of the giant rose on Millik's castle. Matthew forms a plan to break into Sonier prison to rescue Lucan, and Tyr insists he'll lead the group. Tyr and Matthew get into an argument as Matthew strongly advised Tyr against putting himself in danger. This was a decent chapter in the novel, but it felt like it both dragged and was rushed at the same time, if that makes sense. The dialogue in certain parts went on longer than it needed to, and there was a lot of condensing and cutting of story elements to squeeze that dialogue in. Chapter 17 covers the events of Sonier prison and includes a brand new scene with Teo. Matthew recruited Tesla and Kimberly off screen, they forged a letter and Tyr and his group set out for Sonier. When confronted by the prison guards at the entrance, Tyr presented them the letter and told them that Millik's cat is sick and he needs Lucan to examine it. The rest of the prison section is the same as the game. The new Teo scene in this chapter is fantastic and it adds so much more to the story and the conflict Teo is facing in his decisions. Another messenger arrived at Teo's camp in the Caracas Desert to inform him that the Liberation Army has captured Garan Fortress and it's only a matter of time before Scarleticia falls. The messenger tells him that he's been ordered back to deal with the Liberation Army. Teo sighed at the order as he was concerned about the movements of the city-states forces near the border. The messenger told him that they had entered into peace talks with the city-states by offering them favourable conditions and some territory to buy some time. Teo, Alan and Glen Shiel were visibly angry at the news, but the messenger told them it was just a distraction and the talks would break down the moment they dealt with the Liberation Army. After the messenger departed, Glen Shiel complained that it was an underhanded and cowardly strategy, and Alan questioned if he really intends to obey the Emperor's orders, even after hearing what his friend told him the other day. Alan's friend had belonged to the Imperial Guard but was used as a scapegoat and blamed for embezzlement and expelled from the capital. He came to Teo's camp to re-enlist and told them all about the corruption happening in the capital, as well as giving them news about Ted's arrest and Tear being branded a traitor. He had also heard rumours that Kwanda was not taken captive by the Liberation Army but had turned and joined them. Alan and Glenshiel questioned Teo, and Teo said the Empire hasn't been acting honourably, but he can't disobey the Emperor, even though he is no longer the man he once knew. That the light of kindness and compassion in Barbarossa's eyes had been submerged, but he wants to believe Barbarossa's old self still remains. Alan and Glenshiel were losing hope in the Empire, and Teo said they can leave if they wish, but they insist they fight for him, not the Empire. The Teo scenes added in the novel are all excellent. I'm really not doing them justice with these little condensed summaries, but every new Teo scene in the novel greatly adds to his character and massively improves the story. Chapter 18 is quite different from the game, but it's very short. The entire battle against Milik's army has been effectively cut out. Milik believed Tyr was trapped in Sonier prison and had been killed by the man-eating spores, so only a token force remained camped outside Scarleticia Castle. Kirkus's unit fired a volley of flaming arrows at the camp, then Viktor, Flick and Humphrey's units charged the camp and cut the soldiers down while they were scattering in a panic. That's it, that's the battle. Milik appeared on the balcony and almost immediately collapsed. A bright light shot out of him and flew northeast towards the capital, the same as what happened to Kwanda. It was Windy's Conqueror Rune leaving his body. Same as the game from here, everyone wanted Milik dead, but Tyr spared him as he knew Milik's actions weren't his own and the fault lay with Windy. Chapter 19 covers the Liberation Army's first battle against Teo up to his duel with Pan. This chapter contains quite a few differences from the game. It's also a very lengthy chapter and it's dialogue heavy. While the Liberation Army were still in the Kunan region after defeating Milik, a messenger arrived to inform them that a large Imperial force had begun marching south from the Arlis region. The Liberation Army began preparations to return to their castle, and another messenger arrived with Kasumi, who told Tyr and Matthew all about what Teo had done at Rokaku and requested their aid. The Liberation Army passed through Garan Fortress, and it would take another half a day to reach where their boats were anchored to return to Torin Castle, but more messengers arrived to tell them that Teo's army was right on their tail. Matthew quickly devised a plan. He sent Lepont's unit into the forest by the shore to prepare their ships for departure. Everyone else, exhausted from marching day and night, got into formation to prepare for battle. Teo shouted across the battlefield, calling them all traitors and that it doesn't matter who they are, they won't be forgiven or pardoned. He ordered his men to charge. The armoured gull horses were much more powerful than the Liberation Army's horses, and they instantly broke the Liberation Army's lines and trampled many of them to death. Viktor's unit took the brunt of the damage, and over half his unit was killed in the initial charge. Lepont finally arrived to tell them the ships were ready. Cleo protected Tyr as they retreated, while Flick, Viktor and Humphrey's units tried to cover their retreat. But Pon's unit arrived and charged to the front lines. He had his men sidestep the armoured cavalry's charge and slash the gull horses' unprotected feet. The gull horses, while far more powerful than regular horses, lacked stamina, and Pon used that to his advantage. Pon covered everyone's retreat and his unit fought to the last man until only Pon remained. Teo arrived to find Pon standing alone in a field of corpses, and Pon challenged him to a duel. The duel unfortunately isn't described, the chapter ends there. It's a pretty solid chapter overall, and it makes the first battle against Teo far more enjoyable than how it was portrayed in the game. Chapter 20 covers from the secret factory to the second battle against Teo. It contains several differences from the game and includes a short training scene between Tyr and Kai. This is a very long chapter, so my summary might be a little longer than most until now. In this chapter, Matthew speaks to Taiho about Anji and the Lake Torin pirates and hopes to enlist their aid to tie up Sonya Shulin's navy so they can't interfere in their battle against Teo. Taiho sends Yamko to Anji's place to make them join the fight. Everyone spitballs ideas on how to deal with Teo's armoured gull horses, and Flick suggests using the fire spears. It's revealed here that back in Lenin camp, Odessa sent Flick to the secret factory with the fire spear blueprints. Flick, Viktor, Humphrey and Taiho set out to the secret factory to get the fire spears. It would take about 20 days for everyone to return, and Tyr couldn't sit around twiddling his thumbs. He went to visit Kai and asked him to spar with him. Unfortunately, the duel isn't described. It immediately skips ahead to Tyr collapsing into bed from exhaustion and covered in bruises, but stating that he did learn a number of new techniques from Kai. Pan returned by boat covered in cuts. Cleo treated his wounds. As Pan recounted the battle, he said he didn't think there was any way he'd survive that fight, and he's sure Teo let him live. Angie then arrived with 2,000 men and pledged his pirates to the Liberation Army's cause. Flick and the others then returned with the fire spears. The novels describe how the fire spears work. There's a fragment of a fire rune in the tip of the spear, and it's activated by a switch on the shaft, but as it's just a fragment, its power is limited and can only be used a certain number of times. As well as the fire spears, they also recruited many new men. Taiho recruited Konto, who brought along a further 2,000 men and many ships, and 2,000 more volunteers arrived from the Kunan region after they defeated Milik. The 6,000 new recruits replenished their ranks and replaced all of the lost soldiers from the first battle against Teo. The battle itself is pretty good, but not as exciting as the battle against Kwanda. Flick, Viktor and Humphrey's units lined up in the front line, with Lepant on the left flank and Valyria on the right flank. Kai and Varkas led units right behind Flick, Viktor and Humphreys, with Kirkus, Lorelei and Ruby's archery units behind them. Luke's mage unit sat with Tyr and Matthews on the sidelines. The Liberation Army numbered 12,000 men against Teo's 11,000. Teo shouted across the field that no one can win against his armoured cavalry and they're spilling blood pointlessly. Lepant shouted back that he has no ear to give to thieves who put the name of the Empire to shame, and asking Teo to listen to the voices of the oppressed and the suffering of the people of the country. Teo gave his armoured cavalry the order to charge, and as they got closer, Viktor, Flick and Humphrey's units used their fire spears. Teo's cavalry tried to veer to the sides to escape, but were caught by Lepant and Valyria's units. Teo's cavalry were engulfed in flames. Tyr and Matthew, who were watching from the sides, were unable to bear the sight of soldiers burning to death. Tyr involuntarily closed his eyes and Matthew turned his head. The stench of burnt metal and flesh overwhelmed them, and Tyr gagged and almost threw up. When they finally looked back to the battlefield, Teo's armoured cavalry had been obliterated. The fire spear's power had all been used up and the entire field had been turned to scorched earth. All that remained of Teo's forces were his, Alan and Glenshiel's units. Teo gave the order to charge, and despite being outnumbered and having just witnessed their armoured cavalry destroyed, their morale didn't break and they began pushing the Liberation Army back. Matthew ordered Kai and Varkas' units to advance. Kai and Varkas circled around and attacked Alan and Glenshiel from the side. Alan and Glenshiel began using their Thunder and Rage runes to push back the Liberation Army, and Matthew turned to Luke. Luke commented he was starting to wonder if he should just go home. He unleashed the power of his wind rune, and a whirlwind spread across the battlefield, scattering the dark clouds and lightning from Alan and Glenshiel's runes. With their magic blocked, Matthew ordered an all-out attack on Teo's forces. As the Liberation Army gained ground on the flanks, the Imperial soldiers' ranks collapsed under the incessant rain of arrows from the Liberation Army's archery units. Tyr averted his eyes but cried out to his father and rode to the battle against Matthew's protests. This chapter was pretty cool, and the battle carries over into the next chapter. I probably spent twice as long summarising this chapter as any other, but I still don't feel I done it justice. Chapter 21 is the final chapter in the second volume of the 3-volume novelisation. This chapter finishes up the battle against Teo, covers his and Tyr's duel, and has a short scene with Leknaat and Teo at the end. Again, this is a somewhat long chapter and it's dialogue heavy. Alan and Glenshiel had lost all of their men and Teo had lost most of his, but still they fought like demons, cutting down the Liberation Army's troops in droves. The Liberation Army began to falter and their men were afraid to face Teo, who fought like a one-man army. Tyr pushed his way through the Liberation Army lines and stood alone in front of his father. Matthew rode over and requested that Teo surrender. Teo refused and said he's a proud general of the Empire and he serves Emperor Barbarossa. Alan and Glenshiel rushed to his side with their swords raised and said they'll fight to the last man. Teo turned his gaze to Tyr and called him the greatest turncoat under the heavens. He then challenged Tyr to a duel. Tyr was shocked and at a loss for words. The man standing before him wasn't his father, but a general of the Empire who would gladly choose death over the shame of surrender. Tyr knew this war couldn't end without one of their deaths. Teo taunted Tyr and goaded him into accepting the duel. Matthew shouted at Tyr not to take part in this foolishness and ordered Viktor to kill Teo. Viktor hesitated and looked at Tyr, gave a small nod and moved his unit back. Flick, Humphrey, Kai and Varkas' units followed suit. Alan and Glenshiel also fell back and the survivors of both sides formed a ring around Tyr and Teo. Teo charged Tyr with relentless attacks. Tyr was surprised by the weight in every one of Teo's strikes and feared his staff would be cut in two with one wrong move. In between Teo's attacks, Tyr attempted to counter, but Teo blocked with ease. Teo slashed his sword and caught Tear off guard. Tear managed to block the blade just in time, but Teo's sword grazed his forehead. Teo had Tear on the defensive. He fought like a wild beast and pushed Tear back bit by bit. Just as it looked like Teo would be the victor, he said to Tear, "This is farewell, son," and raised his sword overhead. Tear saw it as a final parting kindness, a kindness that was both a weakening of Teo's heart and defenses. Only a number of days ago, Kai had taught Tear about the weak points on the left side of the body that could kill a man in a single blow, and Teo left his left side unprotected. Tear struck Teo with all his might, and Teo collapsed to the ground. Then their conversation is just an extended version of the game's dialogue. The Soul Eater takes Teo's soul, Tear collapses and wakes up in the castle with Lucan and Cleo. Everyone is worried about him, and then Leknaat appears to have the conversation about Windy and the two halves of the Gate Rune. I know I spent a lot of time on chapter 20 and 21, but I kind of had to. There wasn't really much of a way to shorten the summaries of these two without missing out on important details. Teo's scenes in the novels make such a huge improvement to his and Tear's story, and it's a real shame things like these couldn't have been included in the game. Chapter 22 is the first chapter of the final volume of the novelisation. This chapter covers Tear and his group travelling to the warrior's village and learning of Necklord. There's not a whole lot different in the novel compared to the game, except that Flick accompanies the group to the warrior's village and has a little chat with Zorak, who asks Flick if he's finally come home to tell them of his achievements. Victor also gets into a very heated argument with Zorak, who plans to send people to fight Necklord. Victor argues he's sending them to their deaths. Zorak takes offense to that as he thinks Victor is calling the people of the warrior's village weak, and he grabs Victor by the chest. Tear and Flick pull them apart, Zorak apologizes, and Victor explains that Necklord can't be defeated by normal means. Zorak then explains that Necklord had been making demands of the villagers for their daughters, and Tengar had already been abducted. Chapter 23 covers Tear and the group travelling to Clan Temple. Again, this is almost the exact same as the game. They travel to the temple, and Fukian reveals the Cave of the Past. They make their way through the cave, and when Victor grabs the celestial sword, they're thrown back in time to the village of the Hidden Rune. Windy, Necklord and Yuber show up and destroy the village. Basically, it's the exact same as the game, but there's a little extra dialogue at the beginning of the chapter when they meet Fukian. Flick makes a remark to Fukian that the old geezer is still alive, and Fukian gives him a rather scornful gaze. Cleo asks Fukian if he knows Flick, and Fukian said Flick used to cause him headaches as he used to graffiti the temple when he was a boy. Chapter 24 wraps up the Necklord arc. The group leaves the village of the Hidden Rune and travels back to their own time. While sitting around a camp, Victor asks that he be allowed to go to Necklord's castle and defeat him alone. Flick and Victor engage in some banter, and it reminds Tear of the banter he used to have with Ted. That's pretty much the chapter. The whole thing is skipped over in a summary and no details are provided. Chapter 25 covers up to Tear sneaking into the Knights of the Dragon's Den to seek an alliance. It also includes a brand new scene of the traitor in the Liberation Army writing a letter to the Empire. While Victor leaves to confront Necklord alone, Tear and the others return to Torin Castle. They have a short chat about the remaining Imperial generals. Kasim Hazil has 8,000 men and Sonya has 6,000. They discuss forging an alliance with the Dragon Knights. Tear suddenly collapsed in pain as the Soul Eater began throbbing. Lepant rushed to get Lucan, but Tear told him not to. He said he was just exhausted from the schedule, but the truth was he had a feeling something bad would happen when going to the Dragon Knights. Tear, Humphrey and Flick travel to the Dragon Knights, but they rejected entry, so they sneak in through the secret entrance and find all of the dragons asleep. Then it cuts back to Torin Castle. A dove arrives tapping at the window as a man is writing a letter. He feeds the bird a piece of bread and finishes writing the letter, informing His Majesty Barbarossa that the Liberation Army is attempting to seek an alliance with the Dragon Knights and are preparing for an invasion from Moravia Castle. He urges Barbarossa to make a decision quickly and tells him that he'll provide covert support from his end. It's a nice little scene. It would have been cool to have this in the game using a darkened silhouette of a sprite or something. Chapter 26 covers up to Tear meeting Joshua and offering Lucan's aid to cure the dragons. Absolutely nothing different in this chapter except some extended dialogue. Chapter 27 covers the events of Seek Valley up to Ted's death. As soon as they arrive in Seek Valley, Tear felt uneasy. The discomfort in his right hand had not subsided. While walking through the valley, they heard a woman's laughter echo between the crystals. Milia thought it was an auditory hallucination, but Tear stopped as he felt a strange feeling on the back of his right hand. Humphrey and Flick suspected the person who poisoned the dragons may be laying in wait to ambush them. Another laughter could then be heard echoing between the crystals. Now the rest of this chapter is pretty much the same but with slightly extended dialogue. Windy appears and teleports in Ted. She tries to get him to take the Soul Eater, but Ted regains his strength and sacrifices himself to it instead. He thanked Tyr for his friendship and tells him not to allow the Soul Eater to get the best of him. They cross fists one last time, the same way they greeted each other many times, and Ted passed away. They obtained the Moonlight Weed and returned to the Dragon Knights. You may have noticed the summaries have gotten a little short since the beginning of Volume 3. The author kind of sped through the first half of this volume to spend more time on the bigger moments in the latter half. Chapter 28 covers Futch getting the Black Dragon Orchid up to the Dragon Knights allying with the Liberation Army. This chapter also includes a brand new scene with Viktor and Annabelle. This chapter starts the same. Futch arrives at the garden on the roof of Gregminster Palace. He meets Barbarossa and explains to him what happened. Barbarossa lets him take the Black Dragon Orchid and leave. Windy appears and fires a ball of light at him. Black flies away. The ball of light chases them all the way to the mountains in the west of the Kunan region before it hits them. Black dies. They use his liver as the final ingredient to cure the other dragons. Then it cuts to Viktor and Annabelle drinking while talking about how he defeated Necklord. It's revealed that 2 months have passed since he defeated Necklord. He travelled to his hometown of North Window before travelling to Mews to talk to Annabelle. Annabelle was the deputy mayor of Mews at the time North Window was destroyed by Necklord and was sent to investigate the village after its destruction. They spoke for a while about Necklord before Annabelle changed the subject to the Highland Kingdom. She told Viktor the situation with Highland is escalating and she's assembling mercenary groups to bolster their forces. Viktor rejected her offer for now and told her that he's part of the Liberation Army fighting to overthrow the Scarlet Moon Empire. Annabelle says she'll just have to endure without him for now and offers him a room for the night, but Viktor refuses as those aiming for her seat as mayor will surely make a scandal out of her drinking with a guy like him. Viktor then told Annabelle that Matthew has a message for her. Annabelle's eyes lit up and Viktor told her he doesn't know if it's true and that Matthew is crafty, but the northern part of the Empire will be vulnerable soon. Annabelle said it sounds like he's certainly up to something and he wants her to mobilize the city-state's army. She said she'd inform the other cities at the next council meeting. Viktor told her he doesn't want her to get caught up in it, and Annabelle told him he's too trusting and that could get him killed on the battlefield and he's not allowed to die yet. She slapped Viktor's arm and Viktor laughed as he made his way out of the room, telling her not to get kicked out as mayor before they meet again. The scene with Viktor and Annabelle was a nice touch and it gives you a glimpse at what he got up to during his time away. He also had an entire short story about his time away in which he helped a child whose mother had been turned into a vampire in the South Window region. Chapter 29 covers up to the attack on the northern checkpoint. This is a rather long chapter in the book, but it's mostly extended dialogue and some teeny tiny new scenes. It's revealed that it's been a year since their battle against Teo, and it's been 6 months since Tyr returned from the Dragon Knight's domain. Tengar and Hicks arrive at Torrhen Castle and tell Tyr about how Viktor defeated Necklord and was successful in forming an alliance with the Warriors' Village. It's glossed over in a single paragraph. Tyr and Matthew have a somewhat lengthy conversation. Tyr wants to march to Gregminster and end the war as soon as possible, as he doesn't want any more people to die for his rune, but Matthew tells him they can't yet and there's a certain order they need to do things in. He reveals that Angie's pirates are holding Sonya's navy at bay, so their next target should be Moravia Castle, but he believes they have a spy in their midst. Matthew suggests they need to train. 5 days later, the Liberation Army are in Teyen for a training exercise, but Matthew could only muster 5,000 men due to the limited number of ships they had available. The men were divided up into units led by Milik, Quanda, Lepant, Alan and Glenshiel and got into formation. Matthew told Tyr the training exercise was a ruse to trick the spy and that they should attack the northern checkpoint while they're relaxed and unsuspecting. Griffith did his speech trying to buy time, but Matthew saw right through it and ordered the attack. Alan and Glenshiel charged the checkpoint and Griffith raised a white flag to surrender immediately. Matthew forms a plan to defeat Kasim. He sends Alan and Glenshiel to attack the fortresses of Duha and Rakan. If you remember from the game, it was Humphrey and Lepant who attacked those forts. This was a pretty good chapter overall with some minor differences to the game. I know I'm not covering them in depth, but I don't want to spend 10 minutes per chapter covering all the little extra bits of dialogue, but these new scenes add so much to the story. Chapter 30 covers up to Kasim Hazil's surrender. This chapter has quite a few differences from the game. Matthew's plan to be brought to Kasim happens in secret and takes the Liberation Army by surprise. Viktor was never captured by Kasim and he returns during the events taking place, which means Taggart and Warren's roles are cut and they join after. The chapter begins with Lepant screaming in a panic that Matthew has gone to Moravia Castle. Tyr ran with Lepant to the main hall of the northern checkpoint and Milik revealed he spoke to one of Matthew's retainers and Matthew went to Moravia with Griffith. Kwanda then held up a letter that was left on the table that stated they were to depart at noon, and when they arrived at Moravia they were to set up camp at the castle's gates but were not to engage in battle. At noon they rode out for Moravia. The Imperial army were sent into a panic and Tyr halted the Liberation Army as instructed. He ordered his men into formation, Lepant at the vanguard, Milik on the right flank and Kwanda on the left flank. As they watched the Imperial soldiers enter the castle through the back gate, they saw a messy-haired man in a leather vest riding towards them ahead of a sandstorm. Then Matthew and Kasim have a chat. He reveals the city-state's army is coming. Outside, Tyr and Viktor talk, but Viktor tells Tyr to run because that's not a sandstorm, that's the city-state's army. Lepant said they need to rescue Matthew immediately and Tyr ordered an attack. Milik and Kwanda led their units and stormed the castle gates immediately. Back inside, a messenger asked Kasim what they should do and Kasim ordered his men to focus on the Liberation Army, but Matthew talked him into surrendering. This was a pretty cool chapter overall. I like it a lot more than how it played out in the game. Chapter 31 covers the battle against Sonya Shulin's navy. This is probably my favourite battle in the novel and one of my favourite chapters in the entire book. With Kasim Hazil's surrender and the merging of his troops with the Liberation Army's ranks swelled to over 15,000 men. After returning to Torin Castle, Matthew had Thrash make 500 ships out of ice just like he did in the game. The Liberation Army sailed out to meet Sonya where they met Angie and his pirates. Both sides exchanged volleys of arrows to dwindle each other's ranks. A commander at the forefront of Sonya's navy was directing his subordinates with fervent commands and Matthew ordered Lorelei's archers to take him down. He blocked the volley of arrows with his shield, but just then a loud bang could be heard next to Tyr. Before anyone knew what happened, the Imperial commander's shield had been shattered, his chest stained with blood, and he fell into the lake. Unable to comprehend what just happened, everyone turned to the direction of the sound in shock and saw Clive aiming his gun. Sonya's navy divided their forces and tried to use the size advantage of their warships to encircle the Liberation Army, but Matthew told Clive to keep targeting the commanders. Clive commented they make for boring targets as he picked off several more Imperial commanders. After killing all of the commanders, the Imperial Navy's coordination was non-existent. Angie, Leonardo and Kanak began boarding the Imperial Navy ships as the battle turned into close quarters, with Viktor, Flick and Humphrey's units joining them. Kuramimi, Kreutz, Kai and Varkas' units began ramming the Imperial ships. The Imperial Navy quickly began to crumble as ships capsized and the screams of soldiers drowning could be heard. Tyr and Cleo's units sailed towards Scheherazade and Kasumi's units rescued the men who had fallen into the lake. Kirkis's unit fired volleys of flaming arrows towards the fortress, igniting the anchored warships and throwing the remainder of the Imperial Navy into a mad panic as they scrambled to extinguish the flames. Matthew ordered an attack on the Watergate and Angie and the pirates launched jars of oil towards it. Luke was growing bored and asked when it was his turn. Matthew turned to look at him, but Luke flashed a smile and used his wind rune to send a powerful gust of wind through the fort, carrying the flames and igniting the entire fortress in a sea of fire. The ice ships were beginning to melt from the heat, but Kasumi's units had been securing the Imperial warships behind them, ensuring their safety. Tyr and Cleo were concerned for Sonya and made their way to Scheherazade. They spotted Sonya on the roof, giving a speech to her surviving men that they won't surrender as she held a sword to her own throat. Tyr fought his way past the soldiers up to the stairs to the roof. He had many memories of Sonya along with his father. Sonya, who treated him both kindly and strictly after the loss of his mother, and he couldn't bear to lose her no matter how much she claimed to hate him. When he reached the roof, he found Sonya collapsed on the roof with Viktor standing beside her, saying he made it just in time. Viktor told Tyr to escape while he and Cleo carried her to safety. Cleo and Sonya's conversation from the prison cell takes place here. Tyr makes his way out of Scheherazade and finds Matthew collapsed in a pool of blood with Sanchez holding a bloody dagger. Honestly, this was one of the best chapters and possibly my favourite chapter in the entire novel. The battle was excellent, Sonya's dialogue was fantastic, the whole chapter was amazing, and once again I know I'm not doing them justice with these short summaries. Chapter 32 covers the reveal of Sanchez being the traitor, Sonya being convinced to join the Liberation Army, and Leknaat reviving Gremio. Nothing new here, exact same as the game with ever so slightly expanded dialogue. Chapter 33 covers the invasion of Gregminster. Pesmerga and Yuber fans will be happy here as they get more development in this one chapter than they did in every appearance they had in the games combined. This might be the longest chapter summary of the novels, but bear with me. The Liberation Army began marching on Gregminster with 19,000 men. Flick, Viktor and Humphrey's units once again led the vanguard. Kwanda's unit lined up on the left flank and Milek's unit lined up on the right flank. Alan and Glenshiel's units were lined up in the middle, with Kasim Haziel's unit protecting the rear where Kirkus, Lorelei and Ruby's archer units and Crowley, Vicky and Jean's mage units were positioned. Seeing the formation resembling a bird spreading its wings, Matthew then deployed Valeria, Maximilian and Pesmerga's cavalry units as skirmishers, with Pan, Kuramimi, Kai, Varkas, Morgan and Sonya's units to bolster the rear and the flanks. Cleo and Gremio's units were assigned to protect Tyr. A messenger arrived to tell them that the Imperials numbered over 100,000. Matthew and Tyr were astonished as they believed the Imperials only had 25,000 men remaining in the capital. Just like the game, they were almost entirely monsters that were summoned. Yuber, who was leading the Imperial forces, pointed the tip of his sword at Tyr and shouted if they won't come to him, he'll come to them. He ordered all of the monsters and Imperial soldiers under his command to charge. Matthew asked if anyone is familiar with the Black Knight leading the Imperials. Pesmerga stepped forward and said Yuber is his nemesis, but he shouldn't have the power to summon monsters like that. Leknaat appeared beside Luke, who was standing next to Tyr and Matthew, and said that's the power of her sister Windy. Matthew ordered Viktor, Flick and Humphrey's units to move forward and engage. Leknaat moved back to the safety of Cleo's unit and turned her body towards the approaching monsters. She placed her hand on the rune that resided in her chest and chanted to return the monsters to their original world. Her power weakened and only a fraction of the monsters disappeared. Joshua arrived with the Dragon Knights, then launched a hit-and-run attack on the monsters from above. As soon as his unit rose, Milia's unit dove down to attack. Other Dragon Knights continued, one after another, unleashing a relentless attack on the monsters. Joshua then landed by Leknaat, who requested he lend her the power of his rune. Yuber divided his army into 9 units and lured Viktor deep in his lines to trap him. Yuber then appeared in front of Viktor. Viktor faltered from his murderous aura but rallied his men and the two engaged in a heated battle. Viktor was on the defensive and asked the Celestial Sword to do something. The Celestial Sword told him to shut up and keep fighting. Viktor looked at the Celestial Sword's face and saw a desperate expression that he too was fighting against the aura emanating from Yuber. Flick's unit collided with Yuber's right vanguard unit but was attacked on the flank by another and struggled to withstand an assault from 2 directions. Matthew ordered Milek and Kwanda's units to move forward on the flanks to aid Humphrey and Flick. The Liberation Army was slowly being pushed back. The Dragon Knights could no longer provide aid due to the archers on the walls of Gregminster, and Luke's magic disappeared before it even reached the Imperial soldiers. Matthew grew frustrated, but Pesmerga approached and told him Yuber is using the Demon Army's 9th formation. It's a formation developed from a magic circle and it blocks magic from being used against them, and with a strong general in the centre, attacking from the front will lead to defeat. Pesmerga told Matthew to fall back for now and let him take the lead, and when he breaks Yuber's formation, Matthew should order an attack on their flanks. As the Liberation Army pulled back to regroup, Yuber tried to reorganize his men into formation, but Pesmerga charged and broke his lines, telling him that such childish tricks won't work on him. He told Yuber that he'll take his head here and now, and Yuber responded he'll bury him along with the rest of the insects. Seeing the moment to strike, Matthew ordered Kwanda and Milek's units to attack the Imperial's left and right vanguard, while Flick and Humphrey's units charged the centre. Alan and Glenshiel moved their units forward to cut off the Imperials advancing from the rear, and Zorak arrived with the men from the warriors' village. More reinforcements then arrived from the dwarves and the ninjas of Rokaku. Pesmerga held Yuber in the centre, while Matthew ordered an all-out assault on the Imperial army, leaving only Kasim Haziel's unit on the rear. Flick, Humphrey, Alan and Glenshiel broke the Imperial flank and the Imperial army was on the verge of collapse. Milek and Kwanda began closing in and Yuber shouted in frustration while Pesmerga taunted him that he can read all of his tricks. Yuber scoffed in annoyance and turned his horse to flee. Pesmerga tried to chase after him, but he was blocked by the Imperial soldiers. Yuber cut down his own allies in his attempt to escape back to Gregminster, but Eingide aimed his bow and arrow at Yuber and refused to open the gates, telling Yuber that desertion and killing allies are both crimes punishable by death. Eingide called Yuber a traitor and ordered his men to loose their arrows at him. As arrows were flying at him from above and Alan and Glenshield's units were advancing on him from the rear, Yuber became enveloped in a mist and disappeared while saying the country is finished. With Yuber's retreat, the Imperial army outside crumbled. With the battle now all but over, Matthew collapsed from his horse. Tyr then ordered Kasim to join him, Cleo and Gremio's units in attacking the city gates. Overall, this was a really good chapter. It was very descriptive of the battle, but it was also fluffed out a bit with plenty of dialogue. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but I'm not doing these chapters justice with short summaries. These chapters often need 20-minute videos to really cover them properly. Chapter 34 covers up to the battle against Barbarossa, and it does contain quite a few differences from the game. The Liberation Army were attempting to break through the castle gates, but Eingide was putting up a fierce resistance. Cleo suggested they try to talk him down, and Tyr ordered his men to halt. Tyr approached to speak to Ein, who stood atop the wall, but Ein refused to surrender. Tyr then directed the Liberation Army to surround the city. Alan, Glenshiel, Millet, Quanda and Kirkus's units were stationed at the southern gate. Victor, Flick, Humphrey and Lorelei's units were positioned at the western gate. Kasim, Sonia and Ruby's units were stationed at the east gate. He intentionally left the northern gate open in the hopes that Eingide would flee. The battle dragged on for hours until cheers could be heard on the western gate saying that they've broken through. Tyr ordered everyone at the southern gate to continue the attack while he made his way to the western gate. Arriving at the west gate, he found Eingide's body pierced by countless arrows in an upright position, surrounded by a mountain of corpses. Tyr made his way through the castle up to the garden on the roof where Flick, Victor and Humphrey had fought their way to. Victor advised caution as Barbarossa had already cut down many men. Tyr approached and asked Barbarossa why didn't he do anything to stop the tyranny and corruption plaguing the country. Barbarossa said he doesn't have to answer as he hasn't been defeated yet. Tyr asked him to please answer for the sake of the two generals who died for him. Barbarossa's expression changed as if he was reminiscing about Teo and Ein. Tyr saw some hope in Barbarossa's eyes and pleaded with him to come to his senses, that he doesn't wish for any more death. Then we have the game dialogue. Barbarossa insists this garden is the last of his empire and he transformed into the Golden Hydra using the power of the Sovereign Rune. The group struggled fighting against the Golden Hydra and Victor got into an argument with the Celestial Sword, calling it a useless piece of junk for not knowing how to defeat the Hydra. The Dragon Knights appeared and unleashed a torrent of attacks on the Hydra's heads, but it done no damage. Sensing and hearing the commotion from below, Leknaat asked Luke what's happening and he told her a gigantic three-headed Golden Hydra appeared and is trying to destroy the castle. Leknaat commented that Barbarossa finally used the power of the Sovereign Rune. She asked Luke to look up at the castle and tell her if he sees a red star in the sky. When he confirmed that there was a red star, she chanted at the red star that governs the stars of destiny to lend their power to the Tenkai star. Then there's a little montage of the stars of destiny fighting the Imperial soldiers and feeling a sensation like they're being called to the red star in the sky. Struggling against the Golden Hydra, Tyr was about to use the Soul Eater, but Leknaat again chanted at the red star, calling on it to fulfill its role and duty of maintaining the balance of the runes. At that moment, a red light enveloped the Golden Hydra and it writhed in agony. When the light faded, the Hydra was gone and Barbarossa was seen kneeling on the ground, supporting himself with his sword. Chapter 35 wraps up the story of the game. The former Imperial soldiers all appear to talk sense into Barbarossa. Windy appeared and tried to steal the Soul Eater. Barbarossa told her to stop and held her tightly. He told Windy that the Soul Eater doesn't merely devour souls. He then told Tyr that he had the Soul Eater investigated and found out that it governs both life and death, and Windy, who seeks only the power of death, is unworthy to bear it. Windy threatened Barbarossa with her magic, but Barbarossa told her he's immune because of the Sovereign Rune. More or less the same as the game from here. Barbarossa leaps from the roof of the castle with Windy in his arms. The castle begins to collapse and they all fight their way to safety. Flick and Victor stay behind. As Tyr is escaping from the castle, he kept repeating to himself in his head that he won't allow the rune to take anyone's life anymore and he ran away. Lepant was in a panic at Tyr's disappearance and tried to send out search parties, but Cleo advised him not to, that Tyr has faced enough hardships and to leave him be. Chapter 36 is the final chapter in the novel, and it's an epilogue. It takes place 6 months after the end of the game. Tyr was sitting alone by a campfire at night while crying. He heard Leknaat's voice echo beside him. A bright light appeared and Leknaat stood next to him. He wiped the tears away and told Leknaat it was nice to see her. Leknaat reached out to Tyr's tear-soaked hand and sympathized with him for the hardships he's faced. Tyr began to cry once more, but Leknaat reminded him of all the joy and peace he has brought to many people's lives. Tyr recalled everything he had done over the past few years before turning to Leknaat and asking her about the Soul Eater and telling her what Barbarossa told him. Leknaat said she doesn't know about the details, but encouraged Tyr to go on a journey in search of an answer. She asked him why he's travelling alone when he has so many friends and companions, and Tyr told her about the curse of the Soul Eater and how he didn't want anyone else to lose their lives because of him. Leknaat told him that wasn't the curse of the rune, it was fate. He was supposed to meet Ted. She explained to him that Ted suppressed the power of the rune and he should be able to suppress it too. She told him he no longer needs to travel alone and one day he'll discover the true form of the Soul Eater. As Leknaat disappeared, a great joy filled Tyr's body. Just as Tyr was about to set off in the direction of Gregminster, Gremio emerged from the forest holding a torch and Tyr dashed towards him. And that covers the summaries of each chapter of the Soul Eater novel. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I know it's not as in-depth or as detailed as the chapter-by-chapter readings I was doing, but hopefully it done a good enough job to put across the changes between the game and the novel. Are there any parts of the novel you guys wish made it into the game, or if they eventually make a Suikoden 1 anime, are there any parts of the novel you'd like to see incorporated into it? Let me know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.